Now here's Jack Smith, and You Asked For It.
An average house sitting quietly on the outskirts of an average American city. Yet this was the castle of a little guy who, during the bloodiest days of World War II, gained immortality as the biographer of the average American fighting man. His name, of course, was Ernie Pyle. His occupation? The nation's most beloved war correspondent. Ernie's dead now, the victim of a sniper's bullet that found him making that perpetual one last interview. But here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, this white picket fence, which Ernie made himself, this gravestone of a little shepherd dog called Cheetah, whose antics Ernie brought to the attention of the pre-war world. And finally, this simple white clapboard cottage, now a public library, all stand in memory of a man who, with a chewed-down pencil, momentarily turned aside the cold chill of war with words that warmed the hearts of millions. And so to Mrs. Whitney Haney of Fort Worth, Texas, along with the many ex-servicemen and women who've written in, we offer this tribute to the unforgettable Ernie Pyle. Back in 1940, the house was brand new. Instead of books and display cases, there were comfortable furnishings. And here Ernie Pyle, with his dear wife Jerry, spent the few brief moments of leisure permitted a roving correspondent. Ernie was already fairly popular with the reading public. In 1926, he'd taken to the American roads in an old Model T. And by 1940, his syndicated newspaper columns appeared with datelines that measured the length and breadth of the Western Hemisphere. He loved the out-of-doors, and many a column dealt with the simple fascination of nature itself. But it was not to last. The rumblings of war were much too loud. Ernie traded in his familiar cowboy hat for a helmet, and his scratchy, handwritten columns began finding their way to the hearts of an anxious American public. Not that Ernie was unfamiliar with war and misery, but now he was seeing it through the eyes of a participant. And these were the men he wrote about, from the choking dust of Africa, the bitterly cold hills of Italy, the treacherous hedgerows of France, and the deadly beaches of the Pacific came an avalanche of words. Words that told the simple story of the American foot soldier, the dog face, how he lived and how he died. Always a champion of the underdog or the little man, Ernie Pyle could never turn his back on the men on the front lines.
Italy, March 30th, 1944. In times of war, nobody can step aside and just let the world pass by without achieving a feeling of utter defeat for himself. I, too, hate and detest the war and the tragedy and insanity of it, but I know I can't escape. And I truly believe the only thing left to do is be in it to the hilt. I feel if I left it now, it would be like a soldier deserting.
Well, those are the words of Ernie Pyle himself. Words contained in a wonderful collection of letters, which now belong to Ernie's longtime friend, Paige Cavanaugh. I asked Paige about Ernie. I got some pretty interesting answers. It seems that they were more than just good friends. They were comrades in arms. Paige couldn't care less about Ernie's fame as a newspaperman, and he was one of the few people who didn't keep calling Pyle a shy, elfin-like literary genius. There were no airs put on between these two. Just the desire to be themselves, and on occasion raise a little hell. Well, the thing that impressed Cavanaugh the most was Ernie's amazing capacity for interest in people, who they were, how they lived. Now, most journalists wouldn't be interested in how a man caught rattlesnakes for a living, would they? Or what it was like to be shaved by a woman barber in Alaska. Not Ernie, though. He wanted to share the little details of life with everybody. The problems, the hardships, the beauty, the whole works. Sure, he had his faults like all of us. But you couldn't find a more compassionate man or a guy with a bigger love for life itself. Well, like this letter he wrote shortly after the invasion of France. Just a few simple words Still, it's Paige Cavanaugh's favorite passage, and I can understand why.
In a way, it seems incongruous that there should be such peacefulness and quiet. And yet even here in the heart of war, there are interludes of the same unbelievable peace. Long lulls where there's not a sound, and apple trees and grass and hedgerows are so green and pretty, and cows will be mooing in the next field, and a bumblebee buzzing around, nothing else. These interludes are so false, they give you a spooky feeling.
Yes, Ernie Pyle was quite a boy, but he was far from being a saint, and he could kick up his heels with the best of them. His wonderful sense of humor showed through in his many columns, and as these scenes show, he was always the center of attention. Not that Pyle was idolized by the men he wrote about. It was just that they had some kind of unspoken love and admiration for each other. But, as usual, laughter gave way to the business of war. And Ernie was human, too, with his own personal battles to fight. He had a strange lack of confidence in his ability, and like everyone else, worried about his health and his fate.
Guam, March 14th, 1945. It's just a horror for me to go out and talk to people. I feel like I've reached 40 years of age with so little knowledge, I can't even hold up a conversation with 20-year-olds. I'm afraid that if I stay in the combat zone, I'll crack wide open and become a real case of war neurosis. I'm just now coming out of one of the lowest spells I've ever had. Just lay on my cot and let my imagination run wild about my own personal fate in this war.
I'm Dale Bassett. Today I'm a route salesman for a bread company in Denver, Colorado. 15 years ago, I was Sergeant Dale Bassett, radio operator with the 77th Infantry Division. On the morning of April 18th, 1945, started just like any other day. 77th was about halfway through cleaning up Ie Shima, a tiny island off the coast of Okinawa. We were preparing to move to the front lines when I met Ernie Pyle. I had heard a lot about him and read everything he wrote. Well, anyway, I asked him to autograph a snapshot of my baby daughter, Gail. Little did I know at the time it would be the last words he ever wrote. I'll never forget that day. Weather was warm and clear. You could hear gunfire in the distance. In a Jeep just like this one, we moved up to the front to relocate our command post. Major George Pratt sitting on the hood. Colonel Joseph Coolidge, our commanding officer, was sitting in the right seat by the driver, who was Corporal John Barnes. Being a radio operator, I was sitting in the rear by the radio, and Ernie Pyle was sitting next to me. We were traveling up a dirt road across rolling countryside. Other vehicles were ahead of us. All of a sudden, a Jap machine gun opened fire on us from the ridge on our left. We jumped into the ditch and all hugged the ground real close. Ernie Pyle, Colonel Coolidge, and myself on one side, and the other two were in a ditch across the road. As long as we hugged the ground close, we were all right. But Ernie Pyle was the type of man that had to see everything. He raised his head up to look around to see if the others were okay. And that's when he got it. I shouted at him to keep his head down, but it was too late. The Japanese machine gun opened fire again, and Ernie was dead.
Yes, Ernie was dead, and it was no use telling yourself it couldn't happen to a guy like Ernie Pyle. And on every fighting front in the world, GIs paused to pay silent tribute to the best friend they ever had. There were still a few months of war to be fought, but in the simple style he loved so well, the men saw to it that his passing was not forgotten.
Ernie Pyle, the end of a long journey was here. This is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, here in this setting of unmatched beauty on the Hawaiian island of Oahu.
The marker is simple, and it's set amid long rows of markers, indicating the last resting place for men who, like Ernie, gave their lives for the cause they believed in. He rests with the men he knew so well and whose heroism he interpreted so warmly. And Ernie Pyle would ask nothing more.
Real pleasure having you with us. So long for now.